Thanks for having me back. Appreciate
You're
it.
hosting. You're having me back.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
We're good?
We're
Okay.
good anytime.
Okay. Well, welcome to Chris's Corner. I'm Alita, and really excited to be back with you. And Chris just preached an awesome message that I'm excited for everyone to hear. It was really good.
Just so you know, it's freezing cold in here.
Actually.
Which is why we're wearing jackets.
It's so cold.
Yeah.
Sorry not to let my teeth chatter.
I know.
Okay, so you preached on the first 3 verses. We didn't get very far.
No,
But they were really meaty.
Right.
And there was a lot to cover. And so the setting for Jonah is, can you tell us where he is and where he's going to? Because I just like hearing you say it.
Right. He is in Israel, the northern kingdom.
But what city specifically?
He's trying to go to Tarshish.
Yes.
The word of the Lord comes to him, says, go to Nineveh, preach against that city. Its wickedness has come up before me. It's trouble. And he goes in the opposite direction. Nineveh is east. He goes west to Tarshish, which is a great word.
It's a great word to say. You should just try to say it on your own. It's one of those words where when you read it in the Bible, you think it doesn't sound in your head the way it sounds coming out of your mouth.
Right.
So I like hearing people say it. Yeah.
Me too.
And so then you talked about this idea of the Lord speaking to Jonah, and he says one thing, Jonah does the complete opposite. And then you kind of run through these 3 reasons of why does Jonah run. So can you kind of give us a little bit of a recap?
One, I think on the natural level, Jonah doesn't like what God tells him to do, which we can all potentially relate with. It was a hard job. Yeah. Go to a city filled with people who don't like you and don't like your country and don't like your, religion, and tell them a hard message that their wickedness has come up before God and that 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown. And he goes without an army backing him up. He's sent by himself. And so it was risky, it was scary, it was dangerous, it was very hard. And so that was one reason. The second reason I hinted at already, which is the Ninevites were enemies of Israel.
Right.
In fact, the Assyrian Empire, Nineveh is the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and in 722, they would come and actually kind of destroy the northern kingdom of Israel, right? And so these were people that Jonah hated. They were his enemies. And so go proclaim this message to his enemies. And I pointed out that it's actually fascinating because it's a warning of God's judgment. Yeah. And you would think that because they're Jonah's enemies, he would be more than happy to proclaim it. But Jonah knows something about the character of God, and he knows every warning comes with the possibility of heeding that warning, turning from that sin. And Jonah knows that God in Scripture is gracious and compassionate. And when we turn from sin to him, we encounter grace, mercy. And he doesn't want that for the Ninevites. And so he runs.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I've often wondered if there was an element of like almost embarrassment that he would be given the call to go to a people that not only he hated, but also anyone that he would have perhaps, I don't think he probably told people, maybe just out of sheer embarrassment, like, I don't want to be the one that goes and delivers a message that could save our enemies. Right. I don't know. It's just, I think about those things when I read that. What was going on behind the scenes?
And it was also a different call than most prophets get. I mean, when it says the word of the Lord came to Jonah, that's pretty standard. That's usually the start of a prophetic ministry.
Right.
But most prophets would proclaim the word of the Lord to God's people, Israel. And they would maybe pronounce judgment or, on other nations.
From the safety of where they were.
Exactly. They weren't sent to those nations. So that was odd and strange. And I can imagine Jonah playing that pretty tight to the vest, not wanting to share this with anyone.
Right.
For sure.
Yeah. And so you talked about how we're all Jonah, ultimately. We can all have that element in us where you said we're all Jonah until we meet Jesus.
Well, I think the idea there was Jonah was more than happy for his people to receive grace and mercy from God. Because Israel had rebelled, Israel had sinned, Israel's wickedness had come up before the Lord as well. But Jonah was more than happy for Israel to receive forgiveness and mercy and compassion from God, but he was unwilling to see that extended to his enemies.
Right.
And I think we can all sympathize with that. We are more than happy to receive grace and mercy for ourselves,
Right.
our faults, our failings, our careless words, our broken promises, all the ways we fall short. But it's very hard for us to conceive of extending that same grace to people who've really hurt us, really betrayed us, really wounded us. It's like the word of the Lord comes to us as well through Scripture, through the person of Jesus. And sometimes that word is hard, and sometimes we want to run. And, loving your enemies is one very good example of the word of the Lord comes to us, and we say, well, hold on.
Yeah.
I don't know if I want to do that.
Exactly.
And we run like Jonah.
Yeah.
And I guess the second half of it was this idea, because we're like Jonah, because we run from God, we need one greater than Jonah, Jesus, who is God who runs after us.
That's so good.
And it's in Jesus we kind of encounter grace that changes our hearts towards ourselves, towards God, and towards others.
That's so good. When I studied Jonah a few years ago for just doing my own study time.
You mean for the book you wrote on Jonah?
Yes, that was the time.
What's that book called?
It's a Bible study.
Okay,
it's a women's Bible study too.
A women's Bible study. Well, that's just, what's the name of it?
It's called Relentless Mercy.
Relentless Mercy. If I'm a man, can I also read it though?
You could, but I just don't think that you would. It's definitely geared to women. You'd probably roll your eyes at some of the things that
I would never roll my eyes at anything you write. You know that. I love the title. I know you were going somewhere with this, but I love the title, Relentless Mercy.
I think that over and over again in all the chapters, I mean, it's only 4 chapters, but this is what you see, is not just that God is full of relentless mercy, but also that he actually calls us to do the same thing. Like you were talking in your sermon about being imitators of Christ. Like, how do we imitate Christ by having relentless mercy? And I think the reason that I ultimately started studying Jonah was because I like stories that end with resolve, and Jonah doesn't. It ends with if you haven't read it, it ends with a question. That's how the book ends. It's like we don't really know exactly what happens with Jonah, except that the Lord sort of gives him this one-sided question, and ultimately we're supposed to read that, I think, and receive it ourselves. Like, so what will you do with this? How will then you live? And at least that's how I have received it.
I'm thinking also of maybe because this could very well be the most famous story in the Old Testament. And I think of maybe the most famous parable Jesus ever told, the prodigal sons. That story ends with the father going out to the older son, who's very Jonah-like, very self-righteous. And you don't know how the older son responds.
You don't know.
You don't know if he comes into the party.
Which is, I think, written so wisely. Like, this is where I would always suggest that it's not just what is written, but how it's written in Scripture that we should also pay attention to, because I think there's a rhetorical element for us to read that and sit in it and say, as the prodigal son or as the person reading the book of Jonah, how am I like Jonah? And I remember when I was studying it, thinking to myself, who are my enemies? Like, I don't think that I have people that I would think of like the Assyrians, but who are the people in my life where they are the people that bother me, or that I have a hard time forgiving or have held stuff against, and sorting through that, what is it in me that makes me want to just withhold mercy, and what right do I have? So
that's the difference between reading Scripture and letting Scripture read you, and change you. And so one of the questions I asked you in the message was, the word of the Lord comes to all of us, and it's tempting to run at times. And so one of the questions for reflection was, what are we running from? Because it's hard that we should be running towards. I give lots of examples where the word of the Lord comes and says forgive or serve or whatever. But I think the enemy love is the key one as it relates to Jonah. So there's a lot for people to talk about. And so we're going to throw to discussion leaders right now. Have a good small group. Relentless Mercy. Amazon. How much is it? $10?
I don't know.
$20. Whatever it is, it's worth paying for.